All right, now when it comes to the Ukraine war, the ship has really hit the fan. The debate over whether a key battleship, one of Russia's finest, was sunk by the Ukrainians. That's what they say. The Kremlin comes back and say it was slightly damaged. Again, that's what they say. But the fact of the matter that for the second time in as many weeks, the Ukrainians were able to hit a Russian ship from miles away tells you all you need to know about the course of this war for Vladimir Putin. Claudia Rosett joins us right now, the former Wall Street Journal Moscow bureau chief. Claudia, what's interesting about this, besides the back and forth, is at least the acknowledgement on the part of the Russians that, yes, it was hit, not severely, we'll be moving on, but the Ukrainians do this, you know, a lot, not only with ships, but with surprising strength and resilience through this war. What are we to make of all that?
Well, first, I've been critical of the slow walking of weapons to Ukraine and continue to be, but I would assume that was with U.S. help, and good on us if it was. And it's probably a major blow. This was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. Our look-down satellites should be able to tell. You know, we should know, at least in intelligence circles, whether the ship is foundering, sunk, crippled, on fire, hit, what happened. And I
definitely
would be good
hit,
to actually
and it's not sunk, to your point. But go ahead.
Yeah. So what exactly is going on with that ship right now? But it's clearly out of commission, which is excellent. At the same time, I would not underestimate Vladimir Putin. He's playing, remember, a long game here. And while the Biden administration seems to some extent to be banking on the possibility that Russians would topple him from power, possibly via a coup, a general uprising seems unlikely right now, although there are many unhappy people. But I wouldn't bank on it. Putin has many resources, many reserves. And one thing with the Russians on something like this is they tend to just keep going. So this is a really good moment. Celebrate it, and power to the Ukrainians on this. But I would reserve judgment on what's ahead, especially for Odessa.
You know, I'm glad I always love getting your views on what you think is going on back in Moscow and in Russia. As a former Moscow bureau chief, I mean, the sentiment you get out of Vladimir Putin and his tight command is that, oh, very popular. What we're doing in Ukraine is rallying the nation like never before. They point to this poll. I forget what kind of poll it was, that he had 70% approval rating and support. But I juxtapose that, Claudia, with the real economic pain Russians are going through right now. And while they might blame the West for part of it, or the evil United States, sometimes pain is pain. And if it's your leadership there while this pain is being inflicted, you're not happy, right?
Of course not. At the same time, it is a reign of fear. Look, he's just put in Russia's most prison, Lefortovo, the head of the so-called fifth service of the FSB, which is supposed to deal with the former Soviet states and was supposed to be giving him good intelligence on Ukraine. And there's even some speculation that they were supposed to be organizing a really nice welcoming committee for him in Ukraine. That didn't work. That man's now in prison. There have been reports of all these agents fired. That's scary in Russia. And when you see the sort of chance to do some sort of man on the street interviews, people are clearly afraid, most of them, to criticize Putin. So you need to factor in the degree of control that he exerts with what's clearly a very powerful domestic security network. And he inflicts terrible punishments on people who go against him. So you've got that whole balance playing out against the pain. And then factor in as well, Russia is an oil and gas exporting country. He's hurting now, but he, again, is looking out ahead. Russia just signed an agreement with Mongolia for construction of a big gas pipeline to China. Now, that's out there in the future, but he's moving on it. And there are things like that where unless he falls, he may navigate through. In fact, Neil, I would even guess, but this is a guess, I stress, that in some way all this is animating for him. This is a man who loves to plot, plan, manipulate, scheme, subvert, and he's got quite a project on his hands right now. His military has let him down, one would assume, but he's far from done. And things like right now threatening Finland and Sweden join NATO, he will then up the nuclear threat from Russia.
But when he's
as he
threatening
put out.
Finland in particular, with even toying with that idea, I think the Finnish Prime Minister is, oddly enough, at this tech conference going on in Vancouver that is also featuring Elon Musk as a speaker. She is saying she's going to make a decision within the next couple of weeks about this NATO thing. Do you think the threats that Putin has are real? That what would he do?
I don't think, look, first, God help anyone who tries to really invade Finland. Talk about a country where they know how to fight. But I think that Putin is capable of terrible things. We're seeing them right now in spades. It's been going on for years, going back to the polonium-210 poisoning of Litvinenko in London, to refusal of help with the sunken Kursk right after he took power, to what he did in Chechnya. That's clear. But would he actually push it to a nuclear exchange, the risk of a nuclear exchange with the United States? Remember, that would probably obliterate his beloved Kremlin and the vast military cathedral he's built on the outskirts of Moscow and all these other fine projects of his beloved mythical mother Russia that he's right now fighting to restore. Would he really risk that?
But what if he's
doubtful.
nuts, Claudia, and he would? What if he's just doing so many crazy things that it would seem unlikely for a normal leader, but he's not been behaving normally?
No, and at the same time, he's a very calculating personality. And while we're guessing about his psyche, there's a story that's making the rounds about how Putin gave an interview years ago where he cornered a rat in a Leningrad building where he was living, and the rat leapt at him and attacked him viciously. And we have been warned, watch out, because if you corner Putin, he may react like the rat. Well, I wrote a piece recently for the New York Sun pointing out that if you actually read the interview, Putin did not figure himself as the rat. The rat attacked him. In other words, the rat is the other side, NATO, us. What did he actually do? He did not kill or attack the rat. He turned and ran. He slammed the door. And he said he was relieved to have escaped. Now, Putin is capable of terrible things, and when cornered, he might do terrible things. But if we're trying to gauge his psychology, read the actual text, look at what he's done. And the problem so far is that the U.S. has been inviting him to go ahead, in a sense, especially under Obama, who failed to deter or reverse the seizure of Crimea in 2014. And President Biden has been inviting this with everything from the killing of the strangling of the U.S. energy to the disastrous retreat from Afghanistan and the ridiculous off-ramp diplomacy that did not deter the war in Ukraine. Good on America for sending weapons to Ukraine, but Putin has seen one invitation after another. And if I might just, I think he's playing a canny game where he will manipulate us at any opening. I don't think he'd actually risk getting into a nuclear war with America. I don't think he's that crazy. But remember, he's also looking at things like the Iran nuclear talks, where the U.S. has been actually enlisting Russia's help in haggling with the Iranians in ways that would give the Iranians access to huge amounts to billions in frozen oil revenues abroad. Okay, Putin looks at that, and I would wager he sees a similar possibility of deals for himself ahead. So he's trying to maneuver. He's found that he could threaten us, and we don't do anything. What did we do when he said he was putting his nuclear forces on alert? Biden canceled scheduled U.S. missile tests so as not to provoke Russia. Yeah. We need to take some risks. There's no way not to take risk, and trying to duck from it at this point invites upping further, bigger, worse risks. So I don't think that Putin is crazy in the sense of he's lost all touch with reality. I think he's a calculating megalomaniac. And he will, if you really put it to him, I do think he would back down. That's where I'd put my money. I don't think we're at risk of nuclear annihilation from Russia over Ukraine or even over Finland and Sweden joining NATO. I do think we are at risk in the longer term if we keep backing down, because remember, the big brother of Russia, China, is also watching what we're doing. So that's the warning for today. We're good on the Ukrainians for hitting that ship, but we need to stand up to these things more.
All right, well put. And I would put my money on your view of things. That rat, I assume, was an actual rat we're talking about. It wasn't a human rat or someone who had turned on him. So I'm going to explore that story a little bit more. Claudia, thank you very, very much.